She's got the basket. So, we're going to be asking questions now of our four panelists. And I want to thank them for a great job. Wouldn't it be nice if the APA hired McKelly to do site analysis every time the APA had a subdivision application in front of it? So the first question will be for Dave Cox from the town of Day about his town's site protection plan. Dave, we're wondering if the residents of your town have had any complaints since the ordinance went into effect. And we're also wondering if you think other towns in the Adirondacks would receive the ordinance similarly to your town.
If the residents in other Adirondack towns would accept the ordinance.
As I mentioned very briefly, a couple of years after we enacted the viewshed protection law in our town, we took the survey in preparation for a comprehensive plan, and that showed that all of our residents were overwhelmingly in favor of keeping the town as it is, and they didn't want intrusive development such as would be prevented by the viewshed protection law. So that told us that our residents were in favor of the law. There was very little opposition to the public hearing, so we know the town is in favor of the law. The law, to me, seems to increase property values. I know a lot of people would sell their home if they lived across the lake and saw houses up on the side of the mountain, and they'd sell it for a less price than they would without that. It's also for visitors. It's much more scenic and aesthetic. I don't know why a township wouldn't want to adopt it, but there are some that don't.
Thank you. I neglected to mention that I'm here with John Warren from Adirondack Almanac, which is perhaps the premier online news site for the Adirondack Park. So John is going to be sharing the questioning duties with me, and I'll hand the mic to him.
I can't believe they gave me a microphone.
Wow. Well, this is a great question to start, and I think it probably goes to Michaela. Why do we need clustering in the Adirondacks when we have so much open space? Oh, sorry.
I tried to get at that a little bit in the beginning of the presentation to point out that there are some resources that are highly skewed in their distribution, just being on private lands or largely on private lands, that are not, I don't think, captured by very many of the sort of land review processes and development processes that we have right now. So I think that thinking about private land in general is critically important, and we can't just assume that the state lands are going to take care of everything. I think that clustering, just for the sake of clustering, doesn't necessarily do you any good. Clustering has to be done in a good way. If you put the cluster in smack dab in the middle of the lot with no consideration of the underlying ecological features and context, then you may not be gaining anything at all. But I do think that, you know, we have learned much from conservation biology as far as going beyond just the notion of open space. And when you have just open space without any sort of knowledge of how it needs to be configured to preserve ecological processes, then that really is not necessarily getting us to where we want to be as far as protecting biological integrity and ecological functionality. And we know that if we spread things out to a large degree everywhere, you know, eventually there's not going to be any space left. We can conceive of a point at which we literally run out of places to go. So I think that it's all the same issues that we've been talking about for a long time in terms of fragmentation and the things that come along with it.
I just add to remind you people that the reasons for clustering are not exclusively habitat protection. And I'm hearing a lot about the water quality concerns in water bodies that are surrounded or next to your development areas or your existing towns and villages. Clustering can be a way to mitigate, among other things, the water quality impacts that more traditional development is likely to have on that nearby water body, as well as having some of the other scenic and cultural values that some of more compact development can bring.
Okay, here's a question from Dan Plumley. What priority action would you ask Governor Cuomo and EPA Chair Lonnie Elrick to lead on for strengthening park land use decisions?
Clearly, I think this agency needs to put in place a policy on open space, what is substantial acreage and what are small clusters. The staff have been asking for that guidance for a long time, since the 1970s. And despite what the law says, you don't have to go to the legislature to identify, to really hone down and pinpoint what that means for the agency, and to have a debate and to make a decision and provide really good guidance to the staff and that sense of continuity, so that when Bob Glenn retires, the next staff member will know exactly what that is. I mean, there's all sorts of memos and guidance documents in the agency files that get filed away and forgotten. And this needs to be a high profile, perhaps a regulatory change that is clearly provides with marching orders for the staff in terms of those kind of terms, which are part of conservation design.
Okay, this is a question from Phil Terry. How do we apply the principles of conservation design to a series of individual lots? For example, all of the multi-lot, all the examples we've seen have been multi-lot developments. But much of the development in the Adirondacks in the last 40 years has been single lots. And these add up to poorly designed development. I'm not sure who to direct that at. Anyone think?
I think that's one of the absolute hardest questions that there is. I think that it's a critically important one, and certainly most of the focus has been on the design from the standpoint of a subdivision. I think there are ways, however, to apply some of the same thinking and some of the same principles in looking at individual houses, looking at the location of existing development nearby to it, looking at the features that's located on that individual lot, and again, trying to place the development in the area that makes the most sense. And certainly to the extent that we can connect one to the next in terms of ecological connectivity, as we would do in conservation design from a subdivision standpoint, to the extent that we can do that with individual homes, I also think it's important. I don't know if anyone else has a better thought on that one. I agree, it's a very hard challenge.
Is that there's a lot of citizen scientists in the park. There are a lot of them. We're citizen scientists who have training in this park, are spread all over the 6 million acres, and there can be all sorts of ways that citizen science can be trained to help landowners and neighbors to do this work. And we just need to have the will, and I think we will have the way. We have a Center for Biodiversity in this park, and we need a way to really harness the energies of citizen scientists all over the area to help with subdivisions like that, small, large, and where to place development.
Randall Aaron also has something to say on this subject.
It's a thought, and I'm not giving you legal advice because the New York State law is different from the law that I've been used to dealing with. But perhaps site plan review, which you might apply to a Stewart's or some individual property in a village or a hamlet. And I believe that's well established in New York State law, the site plan review for an individual business. Maybe you could apply it as an individual house if it's on a lot that may be, say, 5 acres or greater in size. That's just an idea off the top of my head. But there would be a lot of flexibility as to where you site that house in the driveway if you've got 5 acres, as opposed to if you've got a 1 acre lot. Well, you pretty well don't have a lot of flexibility as where that house goes up.
This is a question for McKaylee. The APA Act gives the agency 2 choices for development on resource management lands, and that's substantial acreages or clustering. And I'm wondering which of these 2 alternatives do you think is better?
I think, again, for reasons that we've talked about, that clustering is a better option than substantial acreages. Even at very large lot sizes, when you do that, you're just spreading it out. Although the houses themselves may be far apart from one another, you're creating incredibly long driveways. You're bringing along the carbon cost of constructing all those places, of the cumulative effect of driving to those places over and over and over again. So I think that choosing to do that just invites more impacts ultimately on a larger area of the landscape. We know that an individual home has an impact zone that extends some 200 meters from it. That's 30 acres. So if you choose deliberately to put those things as far apart as one another, then you're kind of spreading out that impact as far as possible. Whereas if you cluster them together, and they don't have to be on top of one another. My neighbor's house is 200 meters away. I can't see it. But you can overlap that ecological zone of impact and have a much better result in the end, I think, for the remaining area.
So, question for Carl. What has been the response from developers to the clustering ordinances that you're promoting?
I wish I had a better answer. But as I mentioned, because of when the cluster ordinance came into effect in the Pinelands, it was just after the housing economy collapsed. And so there hasn't been a lot of development activity at all throughout the Pinelands, especially in these rural development and forest areas where you're not getting as high a concentration of development potential and therefore higher profits. So I don't think we know yet. A couple of developers have had to work with the Pinelands Commission. I'm not particularly happy with the results, but they are beginning to learn how to use it. There has been no significant opposition. If the development community had opposition to this regulation in today's political climate, it probably would not have happened. So I think they saw the value in it, or they were indifferent because it wasn't where they were going to be working. But so far there's been no concerted opposition from builders or developers at all to the idea of doing cluster development.
This is a question for any of the presenters. Some of this may have been touched on during the presentations, but in your experience, have you found any decrease in the assessed value of conservation design subdivision lots?
I just give one example. The first one I put up, the place called Village Point, that's good to do trick-or-treating in. That development was done by a local builder whom I know, and he's incredibly proud of what he did, and his brother actually lives in the development. It was immediately and enormously successful and has continued to be successful throughout the recession. Those houses sold quickly, even though they're on small lots, they're close together, but people like that, and they like to be able to walk to the village, which is right up the street. So one example where I have personal knowledge, I know that the builder and the residents have been very, very happy with the market value of those units.
My colleague Sarah Reed, who is at Colorado State but is a WCS person, has published a paper in the Journal of Sustainable Real Estate, I believe, where she looked at the price premium associated with homes and conservation and subdivisions, and I think it was 15% higher cost. Is that what it?
25.
25?
25% premium.
25% higher cost that the developer was getting for those homes.
Value is higher or more expensive to build?
Value.
Is it cheaper to build?
I don't, she didn't look at cost of building. No,
She didn't look at that, but
yeah, certainly.
Okay, I've got a question for Dave Gibson. With the additions of conservation easements, how should zoning regulations be modified to limit clear cutting or other damage to sensitive environmental zones? And as a follow-up, should assessments be required on easements?
Should assessments, meaning tax assessments, be required?
I think they mean
Oh, ecological assessments.
wildlife assessments.
Should they be required on conservation easements? Well, I think it's setting up the easement and establishing, and obviously an easement is negotiation, and you have to know, really going into it, what are your primary conservation objectives and your secondary and so forth, and those have to be identified, no question about it. I mean, that's part of why anyone engages in a true conservation easement. So, yes. What was the first part of the question, Jeff?
Should there be changes to the zoning regulations? Should there be changes to the way the easement systems are working now, I guess, in regards to zoning?
Well, yes, I think that the difficulty with the conservation easement program, one of the difficulties of the 1983 law that set up and has enabled the Nature Conservancy and the Open Space Institute and the Department of Environment Conservation to require 800,000 acres, is that there are no regulations. The law, the 19th law, is not backed with clear regulations. It's required under the Act, but it hasn't been accomplished. And this was visible when the agency was approached by the DEC with a change in a large easement that allowed 200 existing structures that were supposed to come off the land in the Adirondacks to stay on the land. Well, there was some planning and thinking and forethought about why those structures should come off the land in the original easement in 1998. Then, decades later, or 13 years later, the agency was approached by the fire department saying, we want to, and the landowner wants to retain those structures. Okay, but how does a large easement like that change, and how is the public engaged on that process? And to us, that was a weakening of the easement. And unless you have regulations that really make it clear to the public how an easement like that has changed, you're going to have real problems like that.
This is a quick question for Dave. You mentioned in your presentation that you require houses to be a certain color. And I'm wondering what colors are they? And do people object that are being told to paint their houses in a certain color?
A certain color would be a color that blends in with the terrain. That would be on a mountainside, that would probably be green, brown, tan, an earth tone color. That would be to make it less visible from long distances. I don't know if people would object. None have applied as yet, so I really don't know why. I would think they'd want to be as least obtrusive as possible.
I was just up in rural Quebec. The issue came up on a big lake up there. And the developers themselves said, we don't want any colors on this lake that are going to stand out, because the value to us in developing a few selected house sites around the lake is to keep the trees basically in front and to have dark green, dark brown, gray, and the color that was universally agreed upon as being a problem is white trim, white roofs. So their whole palette of colors that you can choose from. It could be kind of a dark maroony red, We're not telling people they can't do this. It's sort of like a historic district. Some historic districts, including when I administered in Lowell, Mass. Years ago, we gave people a color palette that was appropriate for the period of their 19th century commercial building. So we weren't dictating, but we were saying, here's your range to choose from. And I think that's the key. Developer of a cluster development in Willistown County, Pennsylvania, only had 3 different house types. But he didn't put the same one side by side. He occasionally turned them around 45 degrees, and he basically chose the colors so that as you looked at it, you would never know there were only 3 house types, which he did to keep his cost down. Enormously successful. To this day, you go in there, there's not a single white house. And people have had the ability to change the original color. Developer chose the original color, and everyone agreed. But when houses change hands, they kept within the palette. And that's a 25-year track record. I'm not talking about a mountainside or a lakefront. This is just, you know, a standard suburban development that was done so well. And I just wanted to point out that color is important, and a lot of people are just fine as long as they've got a spectrum in which to choose.
This is from McCallie. The question is, who pays for biological surveys or ecological surveys? And is this something that could be new business for groups like the Wildlife Conservation Society or Paul Smith students or whomever?
I think it's a good question. I think it's a good discussion point for all of us to think about. The example that I raised was, you know, would it be wrong to ask for a small percentage of the developer's design cost to go toward a good ecological survey? I don't see anything wrong with that, but there is some resistance to making the developer pay for these, I think, in some audiences. Certainly, a group like ours could assist in a whole spectrum of ways, from the relatively simplistic stuff that we did for Brighton, which really was just mapping. We didn't do anything on the ground, all the way to sort of a much more intense field survey. We would certainly have the capacity to do that kind of thing. I'd be happy to help any town that's interested, or any individual project that would be interested in working with us. And I think also there's opportunities that you could use universities and colleges and other entities to do the same kind of work.
It's mentioned that Julie Reagan from Tahoe mentioned to me at the break that in Tahoe, the developer pays a fee to the agency, and the agency selects the consultants for natural resource surveys. A system which incentivizes the consultants to do as good a job as possible and impress the agency so they're more likely to hire them the next time around. It flips the incentive, but still finances it out of the development itself. So I think that's a great system worth considering.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, Julie, we're going to work you into the schedule, and you're going to say something about the budget for your organization at Tahoe.
Well, thank you. A lot of people have been coming up to me asking me for a loan. From the earlier conversation about budget, and as we conclude the day, which has been so fascinating, and everyone is so interested, I wanted just to clarify a couple things about the budget, because funding is a very critical component of any program in the Adirondacks. And our budget of $18 million, there's about $8 to $10 million of that actually doesn't come directly to our organization. We get the money, but we pass it to other organizations. For example, we have a $3 million invasive species program, and we hire in a summer anywhere from 50 to 100 boat inspectors to go around and inspecting boats. So that money comes from the federal government in a competitive grant or an appropriation that we've been able to win, and we pass that out into the community through resource conservation districts or others. We also do transportation planning, transit, bike trail construction, and about $5 to $6 million of that goes directly into transportation initiatives. So it's a little bit of a a different animal, a little bit of a different model than the park agency. And then so if you really compare apples to apples, we get about $5 million from our 2 state appropriations directly. So I just wanted to clarify that. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah,